The morning air around the castle was heavy, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Crowds had gathered beyond the gates, some pressing their hands together in quiet prayers, others clutching flowers, and many with tears already rolling down their cheeks. Inside the courtyard, the royal family stood together, each face marked by sorrow that words could not hide. Kate, her eyes shimmering with unspoken grief, held her place beside William, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though it was the only anchor keeping her steady. The past weeks had been a storm unlike any before. An unexpected conflict had shaken not just the kingdom, but the very hearts of the people who had long looked at the royals for strength. It was not a war fought with soldiers and weapons in distant fields, but a war of the soul, a test of loyalty, family, and endurance. Every headline, every whisper in the streets had carried the same question. Could the family remain united when pain and loss tried to tear them apart? Kate's gaze lifted for a moment toward the cathedral towers that pierced the gray sky. She remembered the laughter that once filled these halls, the celebrations, and the moments of pride that seemed eternal. Yet today, the sound of bells would not call people to joy, but to farewell. The thought made her throat tighten, but she held the tears because she knew the people were watching. She knew they needed to see strength, even if her heart was breaking. William stood beside her, tall and silent, his jaw set firmly, though his eyes betrayed the weight of his emotions. He had always been taught to hide them, to wear the crown with dignity, but as he glanced at Kate, he saw her struggle, and for once he allowed his own hand to tighten around hers. The small gesture spoke louder than any speech. It told her he was not only her prince but also her shield, her partner in this dark hour. The courtyard filled slowly with the hushed sound of movement. Guards in dark uniforms lined the path, their faces stern but their eyes lowered in respect. The coffin draped in royal colors was carried forward, every step echoing like thunder in the silence. Kate's breath caught at the sight, and she pressed closer to William. Memories rushed back, kind words, shared smiles, and lessons given to them both when they were younger. Reminders that duty was not just about ruling, but about serving with love. The people outside the gates leaned forward, many sobbing openly. They had come not just to witness history, but to stand with their leaders in grief. It was strange, Kate thought, how pain could bind strangers together more strongly than joy ever did. She saw an old woman kneeling, a child clinging to his mother's side, and she felt the weight of their trust pressing down on her shoulders. It was not just her own sorrow she carried, it was theirs too. Her vision blurred as tears finally escaped, tracing down her cheeks despite her effort to stop them. She did not hide her face. Instead, she let the world see her pain because she knew it was real, and realness mattered more now than perfection. The cameras would capture it, and history would remember it, but in that moment she cared only about holding William's hand and not collapsing under the weight of the goodbye. William leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper, meant only for her. "We will get through this," he said, though the tremor in his tone betrayed his own battle. She nodded, unable to speak, but her heart clung to his promise. As the coffin reached the steps, the choir began to sing, voices rising softly through the cold air. The hymn was familiar, one she had heard in moments of joy and in ceremonies of hope, but today it sounded like a lament carried on broken wings. The sound of it wrapped around her chest, squeezing until she thought she might break. But William's grip held her firm, and she found strength in the truth that she was not alone. Every detail etched itself into her memory, the flicker of torches, the scent of rain in the air, the polished stone beneath her shoes. She knew this was not just another ceremony. This was the farewell that would mark their lives forever. The world outside the gates did not know the full weight of what was lost, but she did. The empty seat at every table, the missing voice in every council, the silence in every corridor, those would haunt her long after the public tears had dried. Yet even as grief pressed heavy on her, Another feeling stirred quietly within her heart. It was not hope, not yet, but something close to it. A sense that even in endings there was a call to endure, to rise stronger, to honor the one they mourned by carrying forward what they had stood for. And perhaps that was the war she now had to fight, not against an enemy outside, but against despair itself. As the bells tolled and the hymn filled the air, Kate and William stood hand in hand, tears marking their faces, yet strength anchoring their souls. They were not just royals that morning. They were human, and in their pain they were united. The service moved slowly, every moment heavy with meaning. Inside the cathedral, the air was filled with the glow of candles, their flames flickering against tall stained glass windows. Rows of people sat in silence, some wiping away tears, others staring down at folded hands. The sound of the choir rose and fell like waves, carrying sorrow through every corner. Kate walked carefully by William's side as they followed the coffin inside. Her steps felt weak, almost as if the strength had left her body, but she refused to falter. She knew the world was watching, and even in her grief, she wanted to honor the one they were here to farewell. Her eyes darted briefly to the familiar faces lining the pews, dignitaries, family, friends, but she barely registered them. All she could see was the long aisle stretching before her and the memories that poured through her mind. William's presence was steady, and though he did not speak, she felt his silent support. He carried himself with dignity, but she knew his heart was heavy too. The loss was not only public, it was deeply personal. They had both lost someone who had shaped their lives, someone who had stood as a guide through their most difficult days. As they took their seats near the front, Kate's eyes flickered to the coffin draped in the royal flag. A lump formed in her throat. She could almost hear the familiar voice again, filled with wisdom and kindness, reminding her that duty was more than ceremony, it was service. The weight of that reminder pressed down on her, mingling with her grief. The Archbishop's voice echoed through the hall, measured and solemn. He spoke of legacy, of devotion, of a life given in service to both family and nation. His words struck deeply, but Kate could hardly hold them. She was too consumed by the images rushing through her mind, smiles at dinners, quiet advice whispered during private walks, laughter shared in the gardens. Each memory cut her heart, making the absence sharper. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She tightened them together, forcing herself to remain composed. She remembered what had been told to her so many times before: tears are human, but strength is royal. Still, when her eyes blurred again, she let them. She was not only a princess, not only a duchess. She was a woman saying goodbye to someone she loved. William noticed her silent struggle and shifted closer, his shoulder brushing hers in a small gesture of comfort. He did not need to speak. The bond between them was strong enough that she felt his reassurance without words. She drew a shaky breath and let it steady her. Behind them, the soft sound of weeping carried through the congregation. It reminded her that they were not alone in their grief. The whole nation, perhaps even the whole world, was mourning. People who had never met the departed still felt the loss, because they had been touched by their presence, their dignity, their unwavering sense of duty. That thought gave Kate a strange kind of strength. If millions could bear this grief together, so could she. The choir began another hymn, one Kate had sung herself during celebrations in years past. But now, sung slowly and with reverence, it sounded different, like a song of parting, a farewell given wings. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her. It was painful, yes, but it was also beautiful. It reminded her that even in endings, there could be grace. Her mind drifted to the words William had whispered earlier: "We will get through this." She held on to them, repeating them in her heart. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be days when the silence of absence would be unbearable. But she believed him. Together, they could endure. When the hymn ended, silence filled the cathedral once more. Kate raised her eyes and looked up at the high ceiling, where the architecture stretched toward heaven. For a brief moment, she imagined the one they had lost was watching from above, proud of them, urging them to carry on with courage. The thought brought her a fragile comfort, like a fragile flame flickering against the dark dot as the service continued. Kate reached for William's hand. He met her grasp firmly, and the warmth of his touch grounded her again. They were not just leaders on display, they were two people navigating grief together. And that bond, she knew, was unbreakable. The speeches went on, voices honoring a life of service and sacrifice. But for Kate, the most powerful moment was not in words, but in silence. It was in the way William's hand stayed wrapped around hers, in the way the people outside the cathedral still knelt in the rain, in the way sorrow had brought them all together as one. She sat quietly, listening, watching the candlelight flicker, and promised herself that she would carry this strength forward. This farewell was not an end. It was the beginning of her duty to honor the memory of the one they lost, by living with the same devotion, the same courage, and the same heart. And as the bells outside began to toll once more, Kate closed her eyes and whispered a final goodbye, her tears falling freely now, unashamed. The rain had begun to fall by the time the service ended, soft drops tapping against the cathedral windows. Outside, umbrellas opened like black flowers among the crowd, but no one moved away. They wanted to witness every moment, to stand with the royals until the very last step of the farewell. The world seemed to hold still as Kate and William walked slowly behind the coffin, their steps echoing on the ancient stone floor. Kate felt the chill of the air against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold emptiness in her heart. She kept her hand firmly in William's, each squeeze a reminder that she was not walking this path alone. As they stepped out into the courtyard, the murmur of the crowd swelled, thousands of people watching with eyes filled with grief and admiration. She glanced at the faces, young and old, rich and poor, strangers united by sorrow. Some reached out their hands through the barriers not to touch, but simply to show they were there. Kate's chest tightened. She wanted to reach back, to let them know she felt their pain as much as her own, but duty kept her steady. Her role today was not to break, but to stand tall. Even with tears still glistening on her cheeks, William raised his head as the royal guards saluted, their polished boots striking the wet stone in perfect rhythm. The sound cut through the air like a drumbeat of finality. Kate swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the coffin. It felt unreal. How could someone who had been such a constant, such a guiding light, be gone? The thought made her stumble slightly, but William steadied her with a gentle touch at her back. She managed a faint smile of thanks, though her lips trembled. The bells rang again, deep and somber, rolling across the sky. Each toll seemed to pull memories to the surface. Private conversations, laughter in quiet halls, guidance given in times of doubt. Kate blinked rapidly, fighting to keep her vision clear. She could not lose herself now. The people needed her strength as much as she needed theirs. At the edge of the courtyard, the carriage waited, drawn by black horses adorned with silver harnesses. Their breath misted in the cool air, a haunting reminder of life pressing on even in the shadow of loss. As the coffin was lifted onto the carriage, Kate's knees weakened. For a moment, she thought she would collapse, but William's hand caught hers again, grounding her. "It's all right," he whispered softly, leaning close. "We'll see this through." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The weight of farewell pressed harder now. This was the final journey, the last time the coffin would be carried before the world. And once it was gone, all that would remain were memories. That thought made her tears return, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. The procession began slowly, the carriage rolling forward on cobblestones slick with rain. Kate and William walked side by side, their black attire stark against the pale gray of the day. The crowd bowed their heads as they passed, a sea of umbrellas lowering in respect. Some people wept openly. Others sang quietly, voices trembling with emotion. Kate heard it, the soft voices blending into the sound of rain, and it pierced her heart. These were not just her tears, they belonged to everyone gathered here. Their grief was shared, and somehow that made it bearable. She held on to that thought, letting it carry her forward. Her eyes lifted briefly to the castle walls. She imagined the one they mourned looking down, proud of the unity below. It gave her a flicker of courage, enough to straighten her shoulders and walk with purpose beside William. Even in pain, they had to show the world that love and strength could walk hand in hand. Children pressed against the barriers, some holding small flowers. Kate's gaze softened as she passed them. She saw herself in their eyes, young, uncertain, looking to the royals for comfort. She hoped they would remember not the sadness, but the dignity of this day. She wanted them to see that grief did not break them. It bound them together. William squeezed her hand again as the procession reached the gates. Cameras flashed, the bright lights catching every tear, every step, every silent exchange between them. Kate ignored the lenses. What mattered was the truth in this moment, that they were united, that they were human, that they were hurting just like everyone else. The rain grew heavier, drops running down her face, mixing with her tears. Yet she did not hide them. She let the world see her sorrow because it was real, and there was nothing shameful in it. In fact, she realized, it was their humanity that made them stronger than any crown or title. As the carriage rolled on, Kate looked once more at William. His face was set with quiet strength, but she could see the grief in his eyes too. They did not need words. The bond between them was enough. Together, they would endure this farewell, and together, they would carry forward the legacy of the one they lost. The crowd's voices rose again, low and mournful, carrying the procession into the distance. And as the sound of the bells faded into the rain, Kate knew the hardest part was still to come, the moment when the world would leave, the cameras would turn away, and only silence would remain. The carriage moved slowly through the city streets, its wheels clattering against the cobblestones as thousands of people lined the route. Black flags fluttered in the wind, and the silence of the crowd was broken only by the sound of rain and the distant toll of bells. It was a sight no one would ever forget, an entire city mourning as one, following the final journey of someone who had shaped their lives for decades. Kate walked close to William, her steps steady despite the ache in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she did not falter. She could not. Each face she saw in the crowd was another reason to keep moving, another reminder that this loss belonged not only to her family, but to everyone who had gathered in the rain. Children held candles that flickered against the gray day, their small flames like fragile beacons of hope. Elderly men and women bowed their heads, their eyes heavy with tears. Families clutched each other's hands as the procession passed, and in that unity, Kate felt something stir deep within her. Grief was powerful, but so was love. And here, in the shared silence of thousands, she could feel that love more strongly than ever. William walked with his chin raised, though his grip on Kate's hand betrayed his own pain. He glanced at her briefly, his eyes speaking the words he did not say. "Stay with me. We will finish this together." She answered with a small nod, her lips pressed tight against the emotions threatening to spill out again. The sound of the horses echoed against the narrow streets as the procession moved closer to the royal burial grounds. The ancient gates stood tall in the distance, iron wrought with symbols of legacy and history. Kate's heart clenched as she saw them. Crossing those gates meant the final parting. It meant goodbye would no longer be ceremonial but permanent. Her steps slowed for a moment, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. William noticed instantly and leaned toward her. "Almost there," he whispered, his tone gentle but firm. She forced herself to keep going, though each step felt heavier than the last. As the gates opened, the air grew even quieter. The crowd outside bowed low, some falling to their knees as the coffin entered the sacred ground. Kate's tears returned, sliding down her cheeks as the solemn weight of the moment wrapped around her. This was the place where generations of royals had been laid to rest, the place where history lived in stone and silence. Now another chapter was being written. The burial ground was beautiful despite the sadness it carried. Tall trees lined the path, their leaves dripping with rain. Statues stood watch among the greenery, their faces carved in timeless dignity. The path wound toward the small chapel where the final prayers would be spoken. Kate felt her legs tremble, but she held herself upright, refusing to let weakness win. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the scent of lily and the glow of more candles. The coffin was placed at the front, and the quiet murmur of prayers filled the space. Kate lowered her head, her lips moving silently in her own private words of farewell. She asked for strength, not only for herself but for William, for their children, and for all who looked to them for guidance. The final prayers were spoken, voices rising together in harmony. Kate closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It felt like a gentle embrace, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was comfort in faith and tradition. She opened her eyes again, and her gaze fell on William. He looked back at her, his face solemn but steady. She knew he was drawing strength from her, just as she was from him. When the service ended, the coffin was lowered into the ground. The sound of ropes creaking echoed through the chapel, and Kate felt her heart twist. This was the moment she had dreaded most, the moment that made the loss final. Tears streamed freely now, and she did not try to stop them. She leaned closer to William, her forehead almost touching his shoulder. He placed his hand gently over hers, a silent promise that she would not face this grief alone. The Archbishop spoke the last words of blessing, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. Then silence filled the chapel once more, broken only by the soft patter of rain against the roof. Kate stared at the place where the coffin rested, her mind full of memories. She whispered a quiet goodbye, when only she and the departed would know, and felt her chest ache as though her heart itself had cracked. As the family stood together, the crowd outside began to sing softly. Their voices carried through the open doors of the chapel, a simple hymn of love and remembrance. Kate listened, her tears still flowing, but in that moment she also felt something else, a fragile spark of peace. The world was grieving, but it was also honoring. This farewell was not just an end. It was a promise to remember. She stood tall beside William, her face wet with tears but her spirit unbroken. They had reached the hardest part, and though the pain was deep, they had faced it together. And in that unity, she felt the strength to take the next step, even if the road ahead would be marked with sorrow. The palace halls were silent when Kate and William returned. The sound of rain still lingered outside, but within the great stone walls, there was only quiet. The heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the crowds, the cameras, and the hymns that had carried them through the day. For the first time in hours, they were alone with their grief. Kate paused in the entrance hall, her shoulders sagging as though the strength she had clung to all day finally slipped away. The black dress that had felt like armor during the procession now felt like a weight pressing her down. She pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself as tears welled up once more. William set a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "You've carried yourself with such strength," he murmured. His voice was low, tired, and filled with the same sadness she carried. She turned toward him, her eyes shining with fresh tears. "It doesn't feel like strength," she whispered. "It feels like breaking." For a moment, William said nothing. He simply drew her into his arms, holding her tightly as though shielding her from the silence that pressed in on them. Kate buried her face against his shoulder, her body trembling as she allowed the sobs she had held back all day to escape. He did not stop her. He let her cry, knowing that grief needed release. They stood there for long minutes, the grandeur of the palace around them fading into irrelevance. To the world, they were royals. But here, in the quiet, They were simply husband and wife, two people mourning someone they had loved deeply. Eventually, Kate lifted her head, her cheeks streaked with tears. "How do we go on?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. William cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears. "The same way we always have," he said. "Together. Step by step. Even when it feels impossible." His words brought a fragile comfort, though the ache in her chest remained. She nodded slowly, clinging to the thought that she was not facing this alone. They walked further into the palace, their footsteps echoing across the marble floors. The portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their painted faces stern and unyielding. Kate found herself staring at them, wondering how many of those faces had also known this same kind of grief. Perhaps this was the unspoken burden of royalty, not just the crown, not just the duty, but the endless cycle of farewells. In the private sitting room, the fire burned low, its light casting long shadows across the floor. Kate sank onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. William sat beside her, his hand finding hers again. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the flames dance. "I kept thinking," Kate said quietly after a time, "about all the times I was told to be strong, to smile, to hide the tears. But today, I couldn't, and maybe that's all right. Maybe people need to see that we hurt too." William squeezed her hand gently. "They did see," he said, "and they'll remember it. Not as weakness but as truth. We're human, and that's what makes us strong." His words stirred something inside her, a reminder of the connection they had always shared. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. The warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of his breathing eased her heart just enough to bring a moment of calm. But grief has a way of creeping back, and Kate felt it again when her gaze fell on the small table nearby. Upon it rested a framed photograph, one taken years ago during a family celebration. The smiling face in the picture made her throat tighten. She reached out and touched the frame lightly, her fingers trembling. William followed her gaze and placed his hand over hers. "We'll keep their memory alive," he said softly. "Not just with ceremonies, but with the way we live. With the love we give to our children. That's how we honor them." Kate nodded, though her tears fell freely again. She thought of their children too young to fully understand, yet already touched by the absence. It broke her heart, but it also gave her purpose. She wanted to be strong for them, to teach them that grief could be carried, and love could endure. The fire crackled, filling the silence with its soft sound. Outside, the rain continued, steady and unrelenting, like the tears of the city itself. But within the room, there was a fragile sense of peace. Not healing, not yet, but the first small steps toward. Kate drew a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Tomorrow will be harder," she said quietly. William nodded. "Yes, but we'll face it. And the day after, and the day after that." He turned to her, his eyes steady. "We'll face it together." The words echoed in her heart, anchoring her once again. She leaned into him, closing her eyes as the fire warmed them both. The grief was still there, heavy and raw, but for the first time since the farewell began, she felt the faintest flicker of strength returning. Not because the pain had lessened, but because love had not left. And in that moment, Kate realized that love theirs, and the love of those they mourned, was the only thing strong enough to carry them forward. The dawn that followed was pale and cold, the kind of morning where the sun seemed too shy to break through the clouds. The palace was quiet, its halls still heavy with the memory of the day before. Kate woke early, her eyes swollen from tears, her body aching with exhaustion. For a long while, she sat by the window, watching the light grow slowly over the gardens. The silence pressed against her, reminding her of what was gone, but also of what remained. She thought of the people outside those gates, still grieving, still waiting for strength. She thought of her children, who would look to her for comfort, for guidance, for reassurance that even in loss, life continued. And she thought of William, who had carried her through the darkest hours with his steady hand. She knew then that grief would not end today, or tomorrow, or even months from now. But she also knew it could not be allowed to consume them. When William entered the room, he looked as weary as she felt, but his eyes were steady. He walked to her side without a word, setting a cup of tea gently before her. She managed a small smile, touched by the simple act. "Thank you," she whispered. He sat across from her, his gaze following hers out the window. For a time, they both watched in silence as the sun finally broke through, scattering pale rays across the wet grass. "It feels strange," William said quietly. "The world feels the same, but it isn't. Nothing will ever be the same." Kate nodded slowly. "No, but maybe that's what we carry forward. The difference. The reminder that time is precious and love matters most." William looked at her then, his expression softening. "You spoke like that yesterday, without words. The people saw you. They saw your tears and your strength. And I think that gave them hope." Her heart tightened at his words. She had not thought of her tears as hope. She had only felt the pain of loss. But perhaps he was right. Perhaps showing her grief had reminded others that they were not alone in theirs. Perhaps that was the quiet strength they needed, most not perfection, but truth. Later that morning, they walked together through the palace gardens. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Birds sang softly from the trees, their song gentle against the silence. Kate breathed deeply, letting the air clear her chest. For the first time since the farewell began, she felt something close to calm. They stopped before a small bench beneath an ancient oak, a place the one they mourned had often sat to read or simply watch the seasons change. Kate's eyes grew misty as she remembered those moments, but instead of breaking, she felt a quiet warmth. The memories hurt, yes, but they also carried love that could never be taken from her. William sat beside her, his hand finding hers once more. "We will tell the children about this place," he said softly. "We'll bring them here and we'll remind them of everything they taught us. That's how we keep them alive." Kate squeezed his hand, her lips curving into a faint but genuine smile. "Yes, that's how we honor them." The rest of the day passed gently, without the noise of ceremonies or the weight of cameras. Instead, there were quiet conversations, shared meals, and the comforting presence of family gathered together. Laughter came rarely, but when it did, it felt fragile and precious, like the first buds of spring after a harsh winter. As evening fell, Kate stood once more by the window. The sky was painted with shades of gold and violet, the clouds drifting apart to reveal a brighter horizon. William joined her, and together they watched the fading light. "Do you think it will ever stop hurting?" she asked softly. William thought for a moment before answering. "No, not completely. But I think the hurt changes. It becomes a part of us, not to drag us down, but to remind us of what we had. And that reminder can be strength." His words settled in her heart, and for the first time, she believed them. Grief would always walk beside them, but so would love. And love, she knew, would always be stronger. As the last rays of sun disappeared, Kate leaned into William, resting her head against his shoulder. Together they stood in the fading light, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the setting sun. They were not healed, not yet, but they were united. And in that unity, there was hope. The farewell had ended, but the legacy remained. And as long as they carried it forward with love, they knew the one they had lost would never truly be gone.